Yeah, we're live.
Hi.
Very happy to be live with Robert Crouch. Start us off with an intro to you and your books.
Hi. Well, hello, everyone. I write murder mysteries, and I describe them as murder mysteries that stir the heart and the mind because they're not just, whodunits. They're also about the characters that are in the books. And over the series, those characters sort of evolve and have their own stories and conflicts to add to the various murders that are investigated and solved by my sleuth, a guy called Kent Fisher. He's very much an environmental health officer like myself, or like I was. And it was sort of interesting to use a lot of the things that happened in my own profession and in things I've experienced myself, and actually sort of fictionalize them into the stories, really to just give them something a little bit different from all the other murder mysteries that were out there.
That is one of the things I really like about them. Actually, I was going to say that, like you definitely have quite a unique flavour to them.
That's kind of you to say that. When I first started, it was quite a long time ago, and I just I was watching Joan Hickson in Miss Marple, or had the series on DVD. So I was just watching. I think it was A Murder Is Announced, and I spotted one of the clues that helps you to solve the murder quite early on, and I thought I'd never seen it before, and I thought, oh, that was clever. And I just thought to myself, could I do something like that? Could I write something, where all the clues are in plain sight, where an ordinary person, not necessarily like Miss Marple, but an ordinary person could solve, whodunits, murder mysteries, and that's where it all started. Um, and if you read any of the books on writing, which I did at the time, they all tell you to write about what you know. And what I knew was environmental health. That was my job. That was my experience. And I did actually check online at the time to see if anybody else had an environmental health officer as a sleuth, and I couldn't find anybody. So I thought, well, if nothing else, I'll be the first to have an environmental health sleuth.
Does anyone still have an environmental health? I feel like you're probably still the only person.
I think I still am the only person to have a sleuth who's an environmental health officer. So that's my claim to fame at the moment.
I mean, because it is quite I guess it's one of those things that you would have to know a lot about to be able to write about well.
Yeah, well, that's the point. You see, when I was trying to work out what to do, I thought I don't want to write a police procedural because I'm not a police officer, and I just feel that if you're going to write about something, you can't beat personal experience ultimately. Um, I used to work with the police quite a lot, so I knew police officers. I knew how they worked. I mean, a lot of my work was law enforcement, so we were working to the same sort of standards, but that's not the same as being in a CID room, being at a briefing, And I've read people like Peter James who go into great detail about these things, but at the end of the day, he's still not a police officer. I mean, he does a very good job, I'm sure. But I think the police officers know those little details that the rest of us don't know. The little way they treat each other, the jokes they play, all those sorts of things that bring characters and books alive. So to me, it was a case of stick with what you know. The only problem was how does an environmental health officer investigate murder? I mean, you don't go down to the local town hall and say, "Can I report a murder to your environmental health officer?" Be interesting if they did, but they don't. So the police don't sort of advertise saying, "Are there any environmental health officers out there who can help us?" So it posed its own problems, but I mean they weren't ultimately that difficult to solve. I'd already investigated, I think, 7 fatal work accidents. So I knew that if somebody disguised a murder as a work accident, then an environmental health officer could be investigating it, and you just take it from there, really. And that's what the first book was. No accident, it wasn't an accident.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's a good way of getting into it. I suppose I've read the first one. We were just discussing this before we went live, weren't we? I've read 1, 2, and 10 because I wanted to read the most up-to-date one for our chat.
Oh, yeah, we can talk about that. No, it's like everything else. I mean, I'm sure when any writer starts out with an idea, you know, you sort of flesh it out, you think about it. And one of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to have a character with a flaw, because characters are just so much more interesting if they've got a flaw. You know, I mean, Morse liked his booze and his women, and you know, and you sort of go through all the flaws that are out there, gambling, you know, smoking, all the rest of it, and there wasn't really much left. And you know, so I sort of hung everything really on his profession, you know, environmental health. Because I thought, well, nobody really knows what we do, so it's a good chance to show people a few of the things we do, and also it allowed him to investigate in a very different way to, I would say, most sleuths or private investigators. And the flaw, it did eventually come, but more by writing about the character than by sort of any design on my part.
It's not the only thing he's got going about him, though, is it? Because he's got his own animal sanctuary. And books. You know, there's a bit more to him than just being an environmental health.
Oh yeah, I mean, the other thing was that, you know, if you go back to the sort of 1950s, you had all these hard-boiled private eyes from America, and you know, then you also get the cynical, world-weary ones in this country. And I thought, if I'm going to set it in today, you know, in modern times, you know, in other words, I'm not going to set it back in the 30s or 40s. I'm going to set it in modern times. I thought I want a modern detective. So, I mean, for instance, he doesn't drink alcohol. He watches what he eats. He's interested in the environment, tries to protect it. He's got a great love of animals and wildlife and tries to protect that. And I thought these were all sort of quite current things, or they were certainly when I was writing the first book, you know, early in the millennium. And I thought it just sort of set him apart a little bit. You know, he wasn't a cynic, he wasn't an ex-copper, you know, he didn't have a grudge, or, you know, there was no great trauma in his life, because an awful lot of, you know, the police detectives I've noticed these days seem to have, you know, one of their families been shot, kidnapped, or, you know, they've had quite a trauma. And it seems to be quite a trend. And I just wanted to avoid all those sort of, I'll call them cliches for want of a better word, but all those sort of what everybody else was doing. I just wanted to do something different. There's always a risk when you do something different that people go, oh, I don't want that. I want a police procedural. But, you know, it's still a whodunit at heart. It's still a murder mystery. It's just got a different character.
Is there a nod to one of your famous fictional detectives and the dog's name?
Yes. Yeah. I know this is the UK Crime Book Club, and I'm going to tell you that my favourite detective is an American. I am a big fan of Columbo, and I'm rewatching the TV series at the moment, and I just love this idea that he picks up little details. He just tugs at them and picks at them, and he really sort of antagonizes people doing it. But he just slowly, literally pulls the thread, and eventually it all comes undone, and you know, he solves the case. But I mean, the only difference with Columbo is, you know, who the murderer is to start with, and it's about him sort of unpicking what looks like a perfect murder. But that was the idea behind No Accident, that it would be a perfect murder, and that the character would sort of go at it the way Columbo would go at it, you know, picking at little details that didn't quite fit and all that sort of thing, rather than, you know, there's a whole bank of forensic evidence that points in a certain direction. Because, of course, I didn't have the police involved too much in it. So he was doing it all himself. And I just fell back on all those hours of watching Columbo dismantle both egos and alibis very quickly. And I thought, that's the way I'd like to do it. So in the end, I called the dog Columbo. That was my nod to him. I've also named characters after TV detectives here and there as well. You probably haven't read number 4. There was a detective inspector called Ashley Goodman, and the Goodman was the Goodman from Death in Paradise. Humphrey Goodman, I think it was. And in another book, I named the 3 victims after famous authors, and I just like little literary nods. I think it's quite nice to do it. And I think in book 3, I had a company that ran homes for the elderly called Sherlock's Homes. They're just little jokey things, they're just a bit of fun, really, to sort of lighten it up a bit.
But then you'll get really nerdy readers like me that love find the literary references throughout.
Well, I mean, they are aimed at people like you, because at the end of the day, it's like telling a joke that falls without a punchline, isn't it? It falls a bit flat. So if people don't get what you're doing, then you've sort of wasted it. But I always wanted to. I don't know if you remember the 450 from Paddington, Agatha Christie's book. There is an Elspeth McGillicuddy in there, and I'm sure I've got a McGillicuddy in No Bodies, the second book. And it's little things like that. I just like little nods to Agatha Christie and authors I like. It's just a bit of fun.
Is Columbo being a Westian nod to the dogs that you like as well?
Well, we've only ever had Westies. We've only had 2, to be honest. I mean, the thing is that between the 2 of them, they lived for about 33 years between the 2 of them. So I mean, that was a long time. But I see Westies. I mean, I see myself in Westies. Small but stubborn. Really, that's how I sort of look at myself. Or determined, I think is a better word, not stubborn. And I don't know. I like a lot of the characteristics of a Westie. They're independent. They're one of the few dogs that doesn't follow the pack leader, but decides to do whatever they want to do. And they're highly intelligent as well, and they know they're doing it. And I don't know many dogs that do that. So they are, in a sense, quite a unique little dog, and great fun. But yeah, they'll drive you up the wall.
I had a joyful conversation with Harrogate about dogs with someone, and they were saying their dog was getting older, had seizures, and needed some love, and I was like, it was me in dog form.
But if you think about it, I mean, whether you're choosing, I don't know, a car, a coat, a house, a pet, I think you choose something that reminds you of you, or shall we say, some sort of certain characteristic of you. I mean, I'm not talking about middle-aged men buying sports cars and that sort of thing, but I think if you're looking for a dog, you see something of yourself in that dog, and you may not even be totally conscious of it. But it was my wife Carol. She loved Westies, and I when I sort of got to meet one of that, I thought they were just great little characters, and like I say, when we chose Harvey as a pup, he was one of 4 puppies on a farm with the mother, and the mother led them out of a barn in a line, and Harvey was at the front, and she veered off to the left, and Harvey just went off to the right, and the other 3 dogs followed Mum, and Carol just looked at me and said, I know which one you want. And yeah, the one that just did his own thing. And that's what I mean. You see characteristics that you like, or that you think you've got yourself. I don't know. I mean, otherwise we'd all be choosing the same dog, wouldn't we?
Or they choose you.
They choose you.
Yeah, my parents reckoned their dog. They went to see it at a farm, and it was the only puppy that went and sat on my dad. And they were like, it chose us.
Yeah. Well, the first dog, Scooter, there was 2 puppies there, and he came up and started undoing my shoelaces. So he chose me.
But that's got us away from the book. Right. Tell us a little bit about the one that we're here to discuss.
Right. What do you want to know? No time for doubt.
Well, we don't want spoilers, so give us.
There we go.
Kind of a potted description of it without a spoiler.
Right. Okay. If you read the series, you will know right from the beginning that Kent's childhood, and certainly his relationship with his mother, wasn't brilliant. And his mother took him away from the family pile in Sussex when he was, I think, 7 or 8, and they went north to Manchester. And that was never explained in any of the books, though that incident was referred to, it was never explained why she upped and left. And the obvious thing is that it was just a marital falling out. But she turned her back on quite a landed gentry lifestyle, and went to live in a little damp basement flat up north. Not dissimilar from a damp basement flat I used to live in when I was a child. So that was never explained, and I knew that one day I would come back and tell the story of what made her leave and take Kent with her. And this was, I think it's 32 years ago. So No Time for Doubt has a double sort of, I want to say a double timeline. It doesn't have, doesn't flip backwards and forwards, but it deals with events 32 years ago, which are linked to events also happening in the present. So whatever happened in the past is reflected in the current events. And what Kent has to do is he has to go back into his past and back to where he spent some of his formative years to try and find out what it was that led to his mother leaving her sort of home and lifestyle. And then slowly, obviously, he starts to piece things together, and he finds out why she left, which then moves you back to the present where other people are being murdered at the time. So there's a police officer called Belinda there who Kent used to go out with once, as usual. And so between them, they sort of piece it all together and, work out what's happening, why she left, and why this is sort of causing these murders in the present, because obviously somebody is trying to cover their tracks. That's essentially what the book's about. And it's really who is the murderer and why are they doing it. But I combined it with a big personal sort of issue for Mr. Fisher.
So when I was reading it, I felt like you kind of needed to have read the rest of the series to appreciate this. I'm not saying you couldn't read this one first and then go back, but I felt like you probably appreciate it more having read some of the others.
Normally, I would agree with you on that, but I think with this one, the only thing that happened was that his life up north is referred to almost in every book just as a sort of historical detail, but it's never really gone into, other than perhaps the impact it had on him, in the fact that he's sort of bit of a fish out. He was a fish out of water when he was transposed from Sussex to Manchester, and then he was a fish out of water when he came back, and he still is a fish out of water. So really, that was the only references to his mother, and I think in some books there's no real mention of her at all. So she unlike a lot of the other characters around Kent, there was no story to her other than she took him away from his home. So you haven't really missed much, to be honest, in the books in between. But I put a lot more sort of emotional detail into the last three books, actually, but this one in particular, because it was quite a personal thing. So there was a lot more detail of why it happened and all the rest of it. But if you'd read the other books, you wouldn't have known any of this. It would have been a discovery to everyone. So in a way, you can read it as a standalone, and it should stand up absolutely fine. But no,
I think it would, but I feel like knowing Kent's background from the others and how these things kind of affected him throughout maybe gives it more of an emotional wallet.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that he changes from book 1 to book 10. I mean, when I started book 1, my wife actually said to me, she said, Kent Fisher and you are almost identical. And I said, no, he's not. He's nothing like me, the usual stuff. But he probably was. And then as the books progressed, he develops more into his own character, and he went off on his own sort of tangent. but his childhood, whenever it was referred to, was borrowed almost entirely from mine. You know, it's right about what you know. Because when it first started, I didn't want him to be some posh, you know, sort of lovey-dovey, you know, landed gentry sort of rich background. I wanted him to be quite sort of northern, if you like. He was, you know, working class, you know, called a spade, and he had none of these sort of privileges, if you like, that, you know, being wealthy came with. So this was the fish out of water thing, and the only way I could do that was to have him plucked from his family home and taken north by his mother. What I didn't know when I decided to take that approach was that one day I would have to answer the question why, and I decided that book 10 was the perfect opportunity to answer that question. But yeah, his childhood obviously affected him. It affects all of us, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it's good for fans of the series because the characters kind of hold the series, and you don't just get answers about Kent in this book, do you? You find out about other people that you've known throughout as well. I think it is really good if you're a fan of the series to have this book. It gives you some answers.
Yeah, I mean, I started trying to think which book it was. I think it was No Love Lost. I started with No Love Lost, where sort of major incidents happened to some of the supporting cast, and you know, they were always part of the story, but they happened. And I quite like this idea of some of the characters in the backstory, or you know, around Kent, having their own little problems and issues and stuff like that, because it just, to me, it makes the characters more interesting. And quite often it adds something extra to the story, because it's not just about him trying to solve a murder, it's him trying to deal with a stepmother, or, you know, somebody who works for him, or a police officer that's getting a little bit too uppity. And I sort of continued that trend probably from book 6 onwards. You know, there were lots of the sort of key characters around him were starting to have their own problems. So I don't know. It just gives you an extra sort of complication, if you like. I just like things to be as difficult as they can possibly be for Mr. Fisher to solve a crime. You know, the more complicated it is, the better. And you know, I don't want people guessing halfway through who the killer is and all the rest of it. I want them to work hard for it. You know.
I like the kind of subsidiary characters around him as well. So like the people who help him at the kind of animal rescue place, and you know, you get bits of his family and things like that, but all through, like even the relationships he has with like the police and his other co-workers and stuff. You kind of, they're all bring more kind of realism and life to the book, don't they? Because you sort of genuinely want to go back and read the next story to work out what's happening to them as well.
Yeah. Interestingly, I mean, there's a few points here. Interestingly, when I'm looking at writing the next one, I don't plan anything, and I don't say that in a big-headed way, like I'm a clever clogs. I just don't really plan anything, because I like to surprise myself as much as the reader. But it's usually something in the backstory at the end of the previous book that triggers the next book. So this backstory is actually almost a second book within the book. You know, there are, as you say, there are people in there, their lives come under the microscope. You know, they help, they hinder Kent, and they have lives of their own. And there's all sorts of relationships going on, some close, some not. And that was never a plan. When I wrote the first book, there was very few people in the backstory. It was mainly focused on the murder. But as the books have gone on, these, you know, the animal sanctuary he runs, you know, the family friends, you know, his stepmother, his assistant Gemma, they all get sort of, they all evolve as characters as well, and they all have their own little problems and stories. I mean, books 8 and 9 feature Gemma very heavily in some of the, because I deliberately left a 7-year gap between Kent first meeting her and Kent meeting her again, and I knew one day I would have to fill that 7-year gap. So again, that sort of help to occupy 2 books. But what it does is it sort of elevates these characters, as you say, into the story more, and you get to know them more, and you get to find out more about them, because lots of the readers and reviewers keep saying to me, you know, oh, I don't like her as his girlfriend. He ought to be marrying this person, and you know, that, oh, why does he put up with this woman, and why does he put up with that? And, you know, it's quite nice that people seem to get really involved in the characters, and you know, it's a joy really, because you know, I just write these things and hope people will like them, and you know, when they come back with feedback like that, you think, well, you know, I must be doing something right. So I just try and do as much of that as possible, and I end up with, if you like, 2 stories almost, except they always are connected, because if they're not connected, then I don't think it works as a book. You know, I mean, you can't just run. I don't think you can run 2 stories side by side, you know, without them affecting each other. Just seems wrong somehow.
I mean, I'd 100% actually read stories just about the workings of the animal sanctuary.
Sorry, what was that? You read?
But I'd happily just read stories about the workings of the animal sanctuary.
You'd like Jessica Redmond then, wouldn't you? She writes books about Hedgehog Hollow or something, doesn't she? They're very good. The Sanctuary was one of these crazy things. If I said to you, the reason he runs an animal sanctuary is because that's one of my dreams, if you like. One of the things I would really love to do is to have the money and the land to be able to sort of give a lot of animals, you know, a good retirement, shall we say, because that's what it started out as. It was horses that were no longer needed, you know, greyhounds that were no longer good for running. That was how his sanctuary started off, and then it sort of grew into something quite different. But it's I don't know. It was just sort of like me, if you like, living a little bit of a sort of pipe dream, really. That's how it all started, and it just grew and grew. Like the characters in the background grew and grew. And you know, when you write things and the characters start to take over, my view is you go with them. You know, that's sort of something in your subconscious saying, you know, stick with these people. Don't try and, you know, tell them what to do. Just go with what they want. And the backstory started to grow as much as the mysteries.
You do get a little bit of a spoiler about Gemma in this book, if you didn't already know.
That can't be avoided, unfortunately, when the story continues. No, I mean, to be honest with you, every book's got a spoiler for the previous one, I suspect, in some way or form, but it doesn't seem to bother readers at all. I've had people who started at book 4 and then went back to book 1, and by the time they got to book 4, they'd forgotten they'd read book 4 and read it again, sort of thing. So it doesn't seem to bother people. They will all stand on their own, but you get the most out of the characters, I think, if you read them in order, or you read most of the series, because they are an important part of all the books. And I
prefer to read in order, if I'm honest.
Yeah, well, I think we all do. I mean, I will occasionally, you know, authors quite often offer free books and stuff, and you know, I pick them up and read them, and quite a lot of cases I will go back to the first book and then start again. I started one series on book 6 and then went back to the beginning. By the time I got to book 6, I read book 6 and I don't have any memory of ever reading it before. So, you know, you obviously, you know, you don't necessarily hold all the details in your head. So you can read, you know, you can sort of start midway and go back to the beginning and carry on.
What's better is when authors give you a clue about where they are in a series. I remember taking weeks to work out where to start in a series of an author's books, because they all had different names and had different kind of characters in the world in. And you had to go by publication date to work out which one was first. Like, there was nothing telling you which one it was. You had to just do a bit of detective work to work it out.
Yeah, I don't think you can see it on here so easily, but I at the bottom of the cover, you can't probably see it, but at the bottom of the cover, it actually tells you what number in the series it is. And that was, I think that was to answer that question you had, so that people knew, because you can click on Amazon and it says the series in order, and immediately it goes 1, 3, 9, 15, and you think, whoa, hang on, that's not in order. And you usually have to look them up on Google or something like that. But that's why I put it on the front cover. I thought then at least people know it's, the next one's the 10th or whatever. And there is a series list at the back of each book, so people can look there if they want to.
How many are you planning for this to be in the series?
Well, when I wrote the first one, I had the second one already written, and I didn't actually think there would be any more, because the second book, No Bodies, I sent that out to quite a lot of publishers and agents in this country and America, and got, you send the first 3 chapters and a synopsis, and the response, to say it was lukewarm would be an exaggeration. I mean, it was virtually thanks very much, no thanks. But one agent in the UK actually read the whole book in 6-chapter blocks. So this was just in the early millennium, so email wasn't quite as common as it is now. So all this was done by post. So she'd send me a letter saying, can I have the next 6 chapters? So I'd post them off to her, and then another letter would arrive about 3 or 4 weeks later, can I have the next 6? And she read right through the lot, and I thought, oh, I might have found myself an agent here. But she didn't take me on because she said, oh, the characters don't leap off the page. And whenever anybody used to say things like that to me, I used to think, well, what do you mean they don't leap off the page? How can I make them leap off the page? I could never quite understand what they wanted. And as a result, I always struggled to rewrite books. So I was sat there with essentially 2 stories. And the problem with No Accident was that when I said I wrote The Perfect Murder, I did write The Perfect Murder because I couldn't solve it at first. It took me years to work out how to solve that murder. And I never really thought I would write any more. And then lo and behold, No Accident was accepted by a US publisher and published by them in 2016, I think it was. So I actually became a proper traditionally published author. And I won't bore you with the details, but I didn't enjoy being published. And with them being in America, everything was done by emails, and all the royalties were paid in dollars and then converted into pounds. And I think we were heading up towards a referendum on Brexit at the time, so the pound went nosedived, and so my royalties started dwindling, as little as they were, started dwindling. So I decided that I would cut my losses and publish them myself. So I bought back my rights, published the first and the second book, and then I suddenly thought, well, what am I going to do now? So I thought, I know, I'll write another one. And it's great, you just say, oh, I'm going to write another one, and then I just sat there and I thought, well, what the heck am I going to write? And this little line popped into my head, and the line was, they're trying to kill me. And that's how the third book started, with that line. But what I did was I put the character who said it into a luxury care home. And Kent visited this care home with Columbo, his Westie, what they call pets as therapy, which I'm sure you've heard of, where you take your dog in and they, it helps the residents to get a better sense of well-being, and they can enjoy playing with the dog and all the rest of it. So Kent goes in with his dog. This guy says they're trying to kill me, and 6 weeks later he's dead. And so naturally he wants to find out why. And that book there was no planning at all. The first 2 books were planned in enormous detail, but that one, I just wrote it, and I got to the end and I had no idea whether it was any good or not. So I actually contacted another author I know and said, would your editor look at this for me? So I got put in touch with the new editor. The editor read it and she came back and she said, it's great, it needs some work, but it's really good. So that was the third book. And then, having written that, it was just really a case of, well, I'll try to write another one and another one. And the ideas, like I say, started to come from what was happening in the backstory, in the sanctuary or whatever. And I just tried to do something different. I tried to show different aspects of environmental health, not just sort of health and safety or food hygiene. And I don't know if you know, councils, if you died without relatives, so there was no one to bury you, the council has to bury you by law. And that's to do with the fact that if they didn't, you could be left on the street rotting and cause all sorts of diseases. So it's a public health thing. And, I just like to show all these different aspects, that, I think we had a restaurateur from hell in one of the books, and who kicked off on social media about his inspection rating. And there's lots of this sort of stuff in it that I don't think you could find anywhere else. But it's all very much part and parcel of the books.
No, and they do make you wonder about like what that's like in real life. You know, you're reading your books and going like, to pay more attention to the ratings in real life.
Yeah, well, you probably won't remember in the first book there is a character called Tara McNamara. Don't ask me where that name came from, but it just made me smile. And she runs a hotel, and he sneaks in through the kitchen, I think, to go and see her. And that kitchen is a conglomeration of all the worst, dirtiest, horriblest kitchens I ever inspected. So they all went into one kitchen. I mean, it's the world's worst kitchen. But it's sort of, you know, I didn't spend pages describing it or anything like that. I just, you know, just enough to give you an idea that it's not a very well run kitchen. But people do seem to like little details like that. A lot of people say they enjoy the environmental health bits because it's like discovering something new, I suppose. And
well, there's that element of people liking something gross as well, isn't there? You know, it's like those newspaper articles that are like, here's all the 1-star rated kitchens and like what was wrong with them. And
well, book 5, No Mercy, is follows that line. There is somebody who's he's an American guy who owns this restaurant, and I mean he's quite big on Facebook and stuff like that. And he gets a poor inspection rating for his hygiene, which he's unhappy about. And I think it was Gemma that inspected it and scored him quite low. So he makes a formal complaint, and you can appeal against these things. You know they're not set in stone. So he appeals, and you know Kent gets then dragged into it to sort of assess the appeal and all the rest of it. And you know, if you sort of said to somebody, "Oh, what happens in this book?" "Oh, you know, there's a bit about the food hygiene rating system," people go, "What?" And you know, you'd think they'd fall asleep, but actually, most people found it quite interesting. They thought, "Oh, I didn't know all this happened. You know, I didn't know you did this. I didn't know you did that." So it's great, really. It's just not overdoing it. That's why I try and just keep it, you know, in the background as much as possible, because otherwise, you know, I'll be giving away all my trade secrets if nothing else.
Well, I didn't know you could study it. Doesn't Kent go to university and get an environmental health degree? I didn't know you could.
Yeah, no. In the old days, way back in the sort of 60s and 70s, it was people like plumbers, builders, butchers, meat inspectors. They sort of went and did day release courses at college and got diplomas to become environmental health officers, or they were called public health inspectors in those days. So they all came from sort of like associated sort of trades. And then, you know, we got this thing called, you know, getting a degree or a master's degree, and the profession shifted more towards graduate entry. And when I got a job as a student environmental health officer, I was given two options. I could either go to Aston University in Birmingham and do an honours degree in environmental health, or I could do a 2-day-a-week college course and get a diploma. I liked the 2 days a week because it meant I was working 3 days a week and I had a wage, but also you were learning the job. You were learning the theory, but you were actually learning the job at the same time. And that stood me in good stead, because when I qualified, they just said, "Here's your district, go and do it." You know, that was it, sort of thing. Whereas a lot of the university graduates had to really do a lot more training and practical stuff before they could be let loose on the public, so to speak. But yeah, it's, you know, like a building inspector, planning officer. There's loads of these jobs in local government, you know, of professional qualifications, if you like. But yeah, I mean, we're responsible for trying to protect the public from food poisoning, disease, death at work, all sorts of things. It's a very fascinating job, you know, and it's enabled me to write 10 books.
Would you write? Have you got any thoughts of books kind of away from the series? Because Kent is brilliant. I mean, absolutely keep writing them because they're fantastic. But I'm just wondering if you've got any other. I'm working on something at the moment that's quite different. I had
It's all linked to Ken Fisher, strangely, but not in the way you might think. When I was writing, like I said, there was 2 books where it was about Gemma's past. When I had the idea to write about her past and what it might involve, it was quite personal to Kent. So I thought, well, Kent has spent, the last 6 books keeping his emotions well under wraps and not really letting too much out. And I thought it's about time he started to, show his feelings. And I didn't feel quite confident about doing it. So I decided to write something else. Now, do you remember that anthology for the school that you did?
Mm-hmm.
I submitted a short story to that called A Real Page Turner, I think it was called. And it was about a failed crime writer, I think, and a publisher who was trying to, I don't know, pull the wool over his eyes or something. And I quite liked the character or the potential of the character. So I decided to take the main characters and sort of expand it out into more of a sort of story, novel, whatever. And I tried to get a lot more sort of emotional content into it. Really, this was sort of like a practice for the next Kent Fisher. So I wrote this story. I mean, it wasn't that particularly brilliant, but it did allow me to step up a level. And when I wrote No Escape, which was book 8, which is the one I'm talking about, that had a much higher emotional content than the previous 7. And I don't think I could have done it without this sort of detour. But to get back to what you asked, I've now gone back to that extra sort of story that I wrote, and I'm now trying to see if I can turn it into something that's got potential or could be publishable. And it's quite weird, really, because as you know, Kent Fisher's written in the first person, which is not to everyone's taste, but I decided to write this one in the third person, and the reason was when I started writing it, it just sounded like Mark II Kent Fisher, but with a female lead. So I thought, no, I'm going to write this in the third person, and I'm going to have 2 characters telling the story in alternate chapters. And then I suddenly decided that it was about time I wrote a cozy mystery, because I quite like cozy mysteries. So I decided that I would sort of move away, because some people describe Kent Fishers as sort of thrillers, and I always think, oh, it's not a thriller, it's just a murder mystery, but it is actually quite fast paced in a lot of places. So I thought I'm going to try and slow down and write a more sort of cozy mystery, like I suppose we're sort of heading into what is now Richard Osman territory. I don't know if you've heard of Claire Chase. She writes the Eve Mello obituary writer series. They're very much the village setting with the lady and the characters, just suddenly start solving murders, sort of thing. A lot of them bake cakes or crochet blankets and things, but it's not that sort of, not quite that cozy. But I put it in a village setting and all those sort of things. And we're about halfway through. It's different. It's very different from Kent Fisher, and writing in third person is actually more of a challenge than I expected, really, because it's not my natural writing style. So it's good. It's stretching me. That's what I think as authors you want. You want to be stretched a bit. You don't want to. I just hated this idea of people going, oh, it's just like your last. That Kent Fisher's just like the last one. I want them to be quite different, and I want each one to be better than the last wherever possible, which most readers say they are. So I mean, I'm obviously learning something as I go along, but so I'm trying to take all of that and write something a little bit different, but still murder mystery, but more sort of cozy-ish than Agatha Christie, shall we say.
Yeah, I was going to say, Ken, there's a lot happens in the books, but I wouldn't say they were gruesome in any way.
Well, they got, to be honest with you, they got a bit darker towards the end. The last 3 are much darker in content than the previous 7, but they've touched on some quite meaty subjects throughout. I've never shied away from tackling dark subjects, but what I don't what I've never wanted to do. I don't like all this graphic stuff, you know, where people describe how people get killed, and or the one I hate is when books that have women being held captive and stuff like that, or especially certainly children as well. I just don't like stuff like that. You know, you can do that sort of stuff without describing it in inordinate amount of detail. I know some people like it, but you know, it's a bit like the old TV stuff. You know, the murder's almost off screen, if you like. And some of these subjects, I think you can deal with them by not being too graphic about them. And for the same reason, I don't. There's no graphic language in the books. There's a few mild swear words, but there's none of this graphic language because I don't. It's not what I'm writing. I'm sort of writing books that if they were on telly, they'd be on at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night. In fact, one of my American readers described it as James Herriot with murders. It's not quite how I'd describe him, but there you go. So,
wrong part of the world, really.
Sorry?
Wrong part of the world for James Herriot with murders.
Well, yeah, it should be up in your country, shouldn't it?
Mm. Yeah.
No, I'm afraid I spent a lot of my youth in Manchester, just north of Manchester, so I'm technically a part Lancastrian. So, though I love Yorkshire, I mean, there's a lot of lovely places in Yorkshire, but I couldn't write about Yorkshire the way I could write about Lancashire.
That's fair. I'm not from Yorkshire, so.
Ah, right. You just live there.
I do.
Yeah, it is a beautiful county. I mean, I've been there many times. You know, I love the Yorkshire Dales, Malham, places like that, and the Yorkshire Moors were wonderful. And you know, and I read quite a few books. There's one crime series that's set up in I can't remember what it's called now. That on the fishing place on the coast, just north of Scarborough, I think. I can't remember what it's called. Sorry?
Whitby?
Could be. So yeah, there's a lot of good crime books set in Yorkshire.
There is quite a lot of good ones set in Lancashire as well.
Yes, well, old what's his name? Mike Craven. He isn't his detective up in the Lake District, Washington Poe, whatever his name is. Yeah. So yeah. There's a few in Sussex. You know, Peter James is the obvious one with his Brighton connection, but I mean Graham Bartlett's Brighton. So I'm sure if you look at it, there's books probably from every county is probably very well represented. I mean, in Scotland, I mean, there's loads of crime books set up in Scotland. I mean, they have their own genre, don't they? Scottish noir.
Yeah, but isn't that nice? I think a lot of people. I think a lot of people over here quite like to read books set where they know.
Yeah, I mean, people come up to me and they say, "Oh, I like your book." I'll have a car chase across part of Sussex, and people go, "Oh, yeah, I know that place, and there's this house on the corner, and and it's great." I mean, I think it's easy to forget that people get a certain amount of enjoyment out of places they recognise. I mean, I'd never really thought about it that much till people started telling me how much they like, the fact that they recognise the settings. Because I mean, the first thing I did was I created a fictional town called Tollingdon, which does not exist, and it's not in the Doomsday Book or anything. And to create it, I had to obliterate two towns and merge them together. And nobody who lives in those towns has ever said to me, "Oh, thanks for getting rid of us, and putting a different town in our place." But everything else really is pretty much as it is. Is exactly as it is. The Seven Sisters, a place called Burling Gap on the coast. And you can go and look them up on Google and look at the photographs, or you can look on my Facebook page and find the photographs for a lot of them. And people do like them. I mean, why wouldn't they? I mean, these are places they know, and suddenly they're in a book. And I suppose it's quite nice.
Or you'll get people who want to travel down to Sussex and go and have a look at the places in the books. Yeah,
you see, I've thought, and it's a time thing, but I would quite like to write. I don't mean a book, but I would like to write something where I include the places that feature in the stories, and do it as like a sort of, as you say, like a sort of, you could almost have like a Moors tour of Oxford round the South Downs sort of thing. put some photographs in for people and tell them, what the local pub's like and all that sort of thing. Because I think we'd probably be quite interesting as a sort of companion guide to the series or something, But again, it's just finding the time to do it. And, I just like the idea because, I love taking photographs, and it'd be just great to get out there and photograph some of these places again and walk around them, because every place that's in any of my stories I've visited, I've been there and I've been inside a lot of them. So I know, I don't just sort of think like, oh yeah, there's that place, there's that church down the road. I'll go and look at the church and I'll go inside the church, because you never quite know what you're going to find. And sometimes you find little interesting details. And I didn't realize, for instance, that 3 of our country churches all come under one rector, because I thought they all had vicars, but there's just one rector that covers all 3 and you suddenly think, well, oh, wow. And then then I rang up the rector to try and talk to him about something, and I got his, I think secretary is the right word, and she gave me all this information about this particular one of the 3 churches I was interested in. It was absolutely fabulous. None of it really made its way into the story directly, but I'm sure it influenced how I sort of described them, just having all this sort of inside knowledge. So there's no reason why people who read the books wouldn't have a sort of similar interest in these places, if you can do it justice, obviously.
I guess a useful thing as well is if he's across 3 different churches, they're going to be quite empty at times.
Yeah, no, the amazing thing was that this rector, he met Kent Fisher in the local pub in a village called Alfriston. And it's called Ye Olde Smugglers Inn, and it was actually the heart of the smuggling industry, if I can call it that, in the 1700s, And even researching, just researching that pub, hitting the smuggling line, and then finding out how they used to hide things from the tax inspectors and all the rest of it. It's quite fascinating stuff, and little things you could see in rooms that are still there today, but you don't know necessarily that they used to be covering hidey holes and things like that. So yeah, there is a lot of local stuff that's, I think all writers will say that, when they start researching, you find out all sorts of wonderful things, and it's very easy to just get carried away with the research sometimes.
Does some of the smuggling, I'm thinking about like historical smuggling and your environmental health, because I'd imagine like some of the stuff that people could smuggle in now might get up by the odd environmental health.
Yeah, I would imagine it's the border force or whatever they're called who deal with it now. But the big one I think was cheap cigarettes. But I used to be a smoker, and I used to roll my own, and we used to nip across to Calais to buy cheap foreign tobacco, without all the tax on it. But a lot of people bring that into the country, and I would imagine that's trading standards or border force or somebody who deals with that. I know, because I went up to Gatwick Airport behind the scenes, there's a lot of food comes in from African countries, which is sort of stuff that's in their diet that they bring over for the people who are living over here, and if they're not properly declared and they don't have the proper certificates, they just don't come in. I remember standing there, and there was a crate that was about 5 foot by 5 foot full of these giant snails. And I don't know if you've ever seen a crate of giant snails. It's quite scary actually when you look at them. You think, blimey, people eat these. And there's all sorts of weird and wonderful stuff. Vegetables you've never heard of, fruits you've never heard of. So yeah, and it's illegal to bring stuff in your luggage, but a lot of people do. I know of people who've brought cheeses in from abroad, all sorts of things. I don't know what they smell like when they come out the case, but I think some people genuinely don't know there's laws against it.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, but yeah, if you go to any airport, there are environmental health officers behind the scenes dealing with stuff like this. So that's Port Health. I've never done that as part of my job, because I've never worked for an authority that does it, but I have seen behind the scenes, and it's quite fascinating what they get up to.
I'd imagine it would be. I think behind the scenes of anything like that is probably really interesting.
Well, I mean, I don't know, you see, you go and eat at a restaurant, and I don't know whether people sit there thinking, I wonder what the kitchen's like. They might do if the food comes out a bit cold or something, or, I don't know, the cutlery's chipped or whatever. But it's, even as an environmental health officer going into kitchens, I don't know a great deal about catering. You see things on the telly like Gordon Ramsay shouting at people and things like that. And I would imagine most kitchens are a well-oiled machine, like any other place that's producing stuff. Because I mean, if you've got to serve a table of 6 who've got 6 different foods, you've got to know how to time it and set it all up and all the rest of it. And I think, to me, stuff like that's quite fascinating because, I just sit there and eat the finished product, but I don't sort of think like, I wonder how that was made. But I think anything, go and watch a teacher at work, and I think most people would be genuinely quite surprised at what a classroom's like. Well, you know more about that than me, but I once sat in a class and I was absolutely staggered. I just did not realise how complicated things are, and how difficult it is sometimes just to keep everybody sort of hooked and interested.
It can be.
I'm sure it's very rewarding as well. Most teachers I know love it, but love the job, It's like we used to say, we love the job. It's just the public that put us off,
We've got a few minutes left. Tell me what you've read recently and enjoyed.
I'm a huge fan of Elly Griffiths, and I've been reading the Ruth Galloway series. I'm about half to 2/3 through, but I really do love the Harbinder Kaur series. I think she's written 4. I'm reading the 4th one now, because I think The Stranger Diaries was the first one, and that was my favourite book of 2022 or whenever it came out. And then I read, I think the last one was the Bleeding Hearts Yard, which was again absolutely, and I just love the way she draws her characters. I mean, she's just brilliant at creating wonderful characters. And there's a lot of humour in her books, and I think Ruth Galloway probably is some sort of alter ego of hers. She's always going on about weight and all these sort of things that you worry about in middle age. And I don't think for a minute the books were ever designed to be read by somebody like me. I think they're intended more for women than blokes. But I just absolutely love them because I think the characters are brilliant, and I quite like an American author called Cheryl Bradshaw. She writes a private detective series, and she's a sort of modern day Sue Grafton, who's one of my favourite authors. The Kinsey Malone series, Alphabet Murders. But I do like to try a lot of new authors, and I subscribe to things like BookBub and all that, where you often get books offered for free. So there's no risk when you get a book offered for free, is there? If you don't like it, doesn't matter. And sometimes you just discover authors you've never heard of. And it leads to, Claire Chase was one. Her books are set in Norfolk, in a little village, and she has an obituary writer who ends up, there's always somebody famous dies, which she writes their obituary and then solves their murder sort of thing at the same time. It's quite a nice idea. And if you'd have said to me, you're going to end up reading that series, I'd have gone, yeah, right. It's not my sort of book at all, but they're wonderful. Again, it's the characters. I love the characters. And I think if you get good characters, you're halfway there, in a book.
I think you're right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's my only, well, not my only goal. My main goal is to try and make my characters as entertaining and as interesting as possible. And I would love to be able to draw them with the sort of skill that someone like Elly Griffiths does. But one day maybe. I'll keep trying.
On the way. 10th's fantastic.
Sorry.
Remind everyone. We've got a minute left. Remind everyone what they're going to go away and buy.
Well, there are 10 books in the Downland Murder Mystery series. As we've already discussed, No Time for Doubt is the 10th one, which is quite personal. And it starts with No Accident. They're easy to recognise because every title begins with the word no. And all I can say is that they are as complex as I can possibly manage in terms of murder mysteries. And I've been very lucky that some people have compared them to Agatha Christie, which I think is a bit flattering for me. But you know, they are. She is one of my favourite authors, so I mean, you know, I think I've probably learned a lot from her. But they've also got this added bonus that you've got maybe a cast of 4 or 5 characters around Ken Fisher who have their own stories and bring something extra to all the books. And these are the characters that populate his animal sanctuary and his workplace. So they all, you know, so you've got characters in the background, murders in the foreground. What's not to like?
Exactly, and they are fabulous.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say so. And you know, if I can keep writing, you know, great murders and you know keep writing the characters, then I shall be more than delighted.
Brilliant. And that's all that's left for me to say. Thanks for joining us.
And thank you for having me.